Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Rising. Emily, who do we have today?
We've got a great show. We have senior correspondent at Insider, Mattathias Schwartz, who's going to be here to detail the latest corruption scandal surrounding Hunter Biden. That seems sort of like a never-ending cycle. Robbie Suave is back with us as well. Plus, Kim Iverson is going to join us later to discuss her radar and new developments in the United States' case against Julian Assange.
But first, let's talk about testimony yesterday by top military officials about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. General Frank McKenzie, head of the U.S. Central Command, and General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said they both agreed with Army General Austin Miller's recommendation to leave behind 2,500 troops, contradicting some comments made earlier by President Biden. Though they declined to discuss how they advised Biden, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin opened his remarks saying in part, it was the largest airlift conducted in U.S. history and executed in 17 days. Was it perfect? Of course not. General Frank McKenzie said that the war on terror is not over and the war in Afghanistan is not either.
Senator, again, I won't share my personal recommendation to the president, but I will give you my honest opinion, and my honest opinion and view shaped my recommendation. I recommended that we maintain 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. And I also recommended earlier in the fall of 2020 that we maintain 4,500 at that time. Those are my personal views. I also have a view that the withdrawal of those forces would lead inevitably to the collapse of the Afghan military forces and eventually the Afghan government.
So Senator Josh Hawley asked General Milley if he warned his department of drawing down too quickly from Afghanistan before a civilian evacuation. Here's some of that response.
There were concerns that we raised throughout the interagency that when those advisors, if the advisors were to stay, then there's a possibility that, the Afghan security forces would hang in there. We all knew that when we pulled the advisors out, when we pulled the money out, that at some point in the future, most said it was in the fall, that the Afghan security forces were going to fracture and the government would collapse. The speed at which that happens in August is a different animal. The advisors are already gone by mid-July. There is still a government. There is still an Afghan army. And the assumption was that it would remain, and the mission was to keep the embassy open, secure the embassy, transition that off to contractors, and then all the military would be out, and then it would be a diplomatic mission, and there'd be money and over-the-horizon thought. None of that happened because that army and that government collapsed very rapidly.
So Senator Tom Cotton also asked General Milley why he has not resigned. Ryan, what were your big takeaways from the testimony yesterday?
Well, so I'm going to talk about some of this in my radar later today, but this particular part is bonkers. So after 20 years, Milley is saying that their best recommendation was that the government would last until the fall. Mm-hmm. And he's saying that everybody knew once they pulled the money out and pulled the advisors out that it would collapse. It was just a matter of when it would collapse. Well, that would have been nice to share with us a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Instead, we constantly get these rosy projections that we've trained all of these police, we've trained all of these troops. The question of, Washington loves to do the gotcha, like, is official A contradicting official B? Mm-hmm. Biden sort of, in that interview with George Stephanopoulos, and maybe we can play some of that here.
But your top military advisors warned against withdrawing on this timeline. They wanted you to keep about 2,500 troops.
No, they didn't. It was split. That wasn't true. That wasn't true.
They didn't tell you that they wanted troops to stay?
No, not in terms of whether we were going to get out in a time frame, all troops. They didn't argue against that.
So no one told, your military advisors did not tell you, no, we should just keep 2,500 troops. It's been a stable situation for the last several years. We can do that. We can continue to do that.
No one said that to me that I can recall.
He says a bunch of different things. It was a ridiculous interview where he was all over the place. And Stephanopoulos finally got him to say at the end, like, will you stay past August 31st if need be in order to evacuate all troops? And he finally was like, okay, fine, I will. But then he didn't. But then previously, there are two questions. One, did the military want to stay in Afghanistan indefinitely? And then two, come July and August, once it was clear that the government was falling, did they want to keep troops in past this August 31st? And from what I gather him saying, no, at that point, the generals were like, okay, we're done. Like, this is lost. We need to get people out because 2,500 isn't enough to go to war with the Taliban.
Right.
We could maybe prop up the government with 2,500 troops,
which is what we were doing.
Which is what we were doing.
Right.
But once the government's fallen, then you need tens of thousands. And nobody wanted to do that. Now, the earlier question, did the generals want to stay in Afghanistan indefinitely? Yes, I think they did, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's completely true because of exactly what you just said. We were in a situation, we had been for years, where the cycle is that we are there to prop up the government so that it doesn't collapse, because that's been our model for the war, was basically to get the government to the point where it will not collapse. We can sort of leave, and at some point we can just say, we have 2,500 troops there indefinitely, something around that number, and not look like it was a total shellacking.
Right.
But what they didn't anticipate, I think based on their own intelligence failures, was the collapse would happen so rapidly. That is a failure of the military and the intelligence community, and that is a stunning failure on our part to not prepare for such a scenario in a way that could do better than what happened in August. I completely understand the argument that this was going to be a mess no matter what, and that's the fault of everybody that's been involved in this 2 decades long war. I get that argument. What happened in August did not have to happen the way that it did,
right.
though.
And there was an interesting exchange between Austin and Elizabeth Warren, where she asked, if troops stayed after August 31st, would another attack have been likely? Another suicide attack have been likely? And he's like, oh, it's all but certain.
Right.
And she's like, and there'd be casualties? He's like, yes, there would be casualties. And would it do anything to improve the situation in the ground? He's like, no, it would have been the same result. The question was just a matter of when all of this collapsed. And so it just gives off this deep sense of hopelessness to it.
Right. And then again, you get into a situation where you have this 2,500, whatever that level would be, propping up the government indefinitely, because the second that you really start to reduce that, which is what we did, you're going to be in huge trouble. And so whenever you press people, what if you press people who supported staying there indefinitely, neocons, you really ask them, the solution was always an indefinite troop presence. They'll be like, well, we still have troops in Germany and Vietnam. And it's like, okay, so what you're saying is that we should indefinitely be in Afghanistan at some level, some fairly significant level of troop presence. If not, then the government collapses. And so, well, you're telling me that unless we solve the problem of democracy in Afghanistan, we have to be at war with the country?
Yeah.
And that's essentially the answer.
Yeah. Press Secretary Jen Psaki responded to the testimony on Twitter saying, quote, "We are not going to detail those types of discussions, private decisions that happen in the Situation Room for the public." And so this is focusing on whether or not there were disagreements between the generals and the administration on whether to stay. But to me, why isn't it a scandal that these generals admitted that they wanted to stay in Afghanistan indefinitely, yet also admitted that there was no progress being made and that the only way the government could be propped up was by continuing to pump money and advisors into it? Shouldn't that be a scandal? Wait, that's your actual advice that you're giving us?
It's not a scandal because I think it's widely assumed. How long have the Afghanistan papers been out? And it's the same thing that we see over and over again whenever there are reports and there are leaks. It's the same thing that's happening behind closed doors whenever it sort of comes into public view, exactly as it did in the testimonies yesterday. It's just sort of how we assume that it works. We know that the system is something that this sort of, especially in Afghanistan, there was a degree, I think, of coasting,
right.
Especially when you have the contractor complex and you have the military working together in a way like that. I mean, everyone wanted the same thing. They've wanted the same thing for years. And you're right, it's a scandal.
And there's a real strange kind of myopia or chauvinism or erasure going on with this argument that, well, look, we're in Germany, we're in Korea, let's just stay in Kabul, because it misunderstands the dynamic of these of these various countries. There is no insurgency in Germany right now.
Yeah, we're not propping up
There are
the
no
German
IEDs.
government.
We're not propping up the German government. We're not fighting insurgents. There's no movement that has taken over most of the countryside of Germany or Korea, and it's just waiting, for us to leave. And secondly, we're not arming and training German soldiers who then go out and slaughter German peasants out in the countryside or Korean peasants out in the countryside. That's just not happening. That's not part of the theater of Korea and Germany. But it is in Afghanistan, and people don't, or it was, and people don't want to recognize the death toll that was facing Afghan civilians and also members of the Afghan army and police. Those just didn't matter. It's a shame that we're going to lose 1 or 2 American troops a month. That was the argument. And it's a shame that it cost this much money, but that's the only cost. There's just a brutality or a barbarism to not saying that Afghan lives matter too, for lack of a better phrase.
So General Milley, he also weighed in on his calls to Chinese officials under the Trump administration, saying during the Senate hearing, I am certain that President Trump did not intend to attack the Chinese. So Ryan, to the point that you were just making about sort of what's said openly and what's said privately, how big is Milley's admission there?
So is he saying here, there was nothing wrong with me relaying this information to the Chinese because it was true? Trump wasn't going to nuke China, yet China was like, whoa, this dude's a little crazy. Are we going to get nuked? And so he was just reassuring them? Is that kind of what he's going for here?
It must be, because, again, what we've heard is that the Chinese intelligence seemed to be, and who knows what's actually true, because what's being pushed into the media is from people with conflicting interests, I'm sure. But the Chinese intelligence services had it for some reason that Donald Trump was going to attack China.
They wouldn't be the first intelligence service to completely get it wrong when it comes to a foreign country.
Shocking. It would truly be earth-shattering for intelligence services to have
no idea what they're doing.
Right. And so Milley felt the need to then go and subvert the process. I don't think this does anything to justify what he did in terms of saying to the Chinese official, I'd call you and give you a heads up. I don't think he justifies that at all.
What good is a heads up? I guess you can get to your bunker.
Yeah, get to your bunker, right.
That's nice. Got to have friends that were close to the trigger, I guess.
You're right.
Anyway, we'll tell you what's on our radars up next.